You get $15, Dad? That's it. Danny's voice cut through the phone like a rusty blade, dripping with satisfaction. He wanted me there for the will reading, front and center, just to watch my face when they read out loud how worthless I was. What he didn't know was that his mother, even in death, had one last move to play. My name is Roger Martinez. I'm 50 years old, and for the past 5 years, the sound of my woodworker's plane has been my only companion. Here in my small workshop in Austin, Texas, I wasn't a failed architect anymore. I wasn't a discarded husband. I was just a carpenter who built honest things from broken pieces. The workshop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, the only cologne I wore these days. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air like tiny galaxies. My current project, a rocking chair made from Texas walnut, sat half-finished on the bench. The wood grain was beautiful. Honest? It didn't lie or deceive. It simply was, with all its knots and imperfections. I was working on shaping the armrest when my old flip phone started buzzing on the cluttered workbench. The sound was harsh against the workshop's peaceful silence. The caller ID showed 2 words I hadn't seen in 20 years, Danny Morrison, my son. 20 years without a single call that wasn't a demand or an insult. 20 years of silence I'd assumed would last until one of us was in the ground. Roger, he said when I picked up. He never called me Dad anymore. Just Roger, like I was some distant acquaintance he barely tolerated. Victoria's gone. Strote last week, it was fast. Victoria, my ex-wife. The words hit me like a physical blow, but they didn't seem to fit. She'd always been a force of nature, a hurricane of ambition and creativity. Brilliant, beautiful, and utterly destructive when she set her mind to something. To think of her as just gone felt fundamentally wrong, like someone had told me the sun had burned out. The funeral? I started to ask, my throat suddenly dry. It's over. You weren't on the list. He cut me off with casual cruelty. There was no emotion in his voice, no grief. He delivered the news like he was reading stock prices. Listen, this is why I'm calling. Her lawyer needs you there, the will reading. Friday, 10 a.m., sharp. Caldwell and Finch, Manhattan, don't be late. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, a command delivered from on high by a son who'd long ago appointed himself king of a world I no longer belonged to. I could picture him in his expensive office, probably wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly expenses, looking out at a view I'd once helped design. I have no reason to be there, Danny. Victoria and I settled everything 20 years ago in that courtroom. I have nothing that belongs to her, and she has nothing that belongs to me. A sound came through the phone then, a short, ugly bark of laughter. It was stripped of all humor, a noise of pure contempt that stirred something deep inside me I'd thought was long dead. Oh, I know you're not getting a dime, he sneered. Don't be a fool. Mom despised you, everyone knows that. But it's a legal formality, some procedural thing. You have to be there in person to officially hear that you're a zero, a documented, notarized confirmation of your complete irrelevance to this family. He paused, letting the poison sink in. I could practically hear his satisfaction through the phone. Personally, I just want to be there to see your face. I want to watch that quiet, fake dignity of yours crumble when you hear it read out loud. It's the only entertainment you're good for anymore. The only value you have left. The humiliation was so raw, so direct, it was almost impressive. This wasn't the anger of a wounded son lashing out in grief. This was calculated cruelty, the methodical torture of a victor who wanted to rub his opponent's face in the dirt until nothing remained. Are you finished? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet almost. He said, his tone dripping with condescending amusement. Don't worry about the trip back to whatever hole you crawled out of. I'll spot you $15 for the bus ride home. Think of it as a parting gift from the Morrison family. And then the line went dead. Click. Just like that. 20 years of silence were broken only to deliver one final insult. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. The workshop's peaceful silence rushed back in, but it felt different now, heavy. Suffocating. The anger I'd buried under years of sawdust and quiet resignation began to smolder like a coal that had been banked but never truly died. He hadn't invited me to a will reading. He had summoned me to a public execution. My execution. He wanted a show, wanted to humiliate the old man one last time in front of witnesses, wanted to officially mark the end of whatever connection we'd once had. Fine. He wanted a show? He'd get one. I closed the phone and set it down with deliberate care. I walked over to the half-finished rocking chair and ran my hand along its smooth, honest curve. The wood was warm under my palms, solid and real. Then I turned and walked into the small house attached to the workshop. I went to my bedroom closet, past the flannel shirts and worn jeans that were my daily uniform. In the very back, covered in a thin layer of dust like a shroud, hung a garment bag I hadn't touched in 2 decades. I pulled it out with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something that felt like anticipation. Inside was my only suit, charcoal gray wool, so fine you couldn't find it much anymore. It was the same suit I'd worn on the day my old life ended. The day I'd walked out of that courthouse a different man than I'd walked in. The fabric was good quality, well made, but it was 20 years out of style now. The cut too generous, the shoulders too padded for current fashion. I held it up to the light filtering through the bedroom window. It was clean. I'd had it cleaned before storing it away, some instinct telling me I might need it again someday. But it smelled faintly of mothballs and time. The scent of preservation and decay mixed together. I would wear it again. Not as the uniform of defeated had been before, but as armor for whatever battle was coming. Because Danny was wrong about one thing, I wasn't the same man who'd been broken in that courtroom 20 years ago. That man had been naive, trusting, willing to sacrifice everything for people who didn't deserve it. This man was different. This man had learned patience. This man knew how to wait. Friday morning, the cab ride from LaGuardia felt like traveling through dimensions. Austin's quiet, sun-baked streets were a distant memory, replaced by the towering canyons of steel and glass that made up Manhattan. I paid the driver, the fare stung more than I'd expected, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was different here. Colder, sharper, carrying the weight of 8 million ambitions and twice as many disappointments. Car horns blared, people rushed past without making eye contact, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed its urgent song. This was Danny's world now, a place where money talked and everything else whispered. The building housing Caldwell and Finch didn't just occupy its corner of the street, it dominated it. A sheer cliff of dark glass and polished granite that stretched up until it seemed to scrape the gray October sky. The architect in me, the part that had once designed buildings like this, couldn't help but admire the clean lines and the way the morning light caught the facade. But the carpenter in me, the man I'd become, saw it for what it really was, a fortress built to intimidate. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, and the chaos of the city was instantly cut off, replaced by a deep, reverent hush. The lobby was a cathedral built to worship money. The floors were acres of white marble, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the soaring ceiling far above. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany that gleamed with fresh oil and old wealth. The air itself felt expensive, climate-controlled to perfection and scented with something that probably cost more per ounce than my monthly grocery budget. I had spent my entire career designing buildings, but I had never designed a space like this. This wasn't built for people. It was built to remind every person who entered just how small they were in the grand scheme of things. How insignificant their problems must be compared to the vast machinery of wealth that operated in these halls. I was wearing my charcoal suit, the good wool one that had seen better decades. I'd pressed it myself back in Austin, taking care to get the crease in the pants sharp as a knife's edge. The shirt was white cotton, also pressed, with a collar that was slightly frayed but clean. My shoes were leather, resoled twice but polished to a decent shine. It was the best I had, the armor I'd chosen for this battle. But walking across that marble expanse, I felt like a smudge of grease on a pristine canvas. The suit was clean and pressed, but it was old. The cut was wrong, the shoulders too padded for current fashion. It screamed outdated to anyone who cared to look, and in a place like this, everyone cared to look. A few young lawyers, men and women in their 30s wearing suits that probably cost more than my truck, glanced up from their phones as I passed. Their eyes didn't linger. They scanned, categorized, and dismissed me in one fluid motion. Not a client, not a threat, not worth their time. Just an old man in an old suit, probably here to contest a parking ticket or settle some small claims nonsense. My footsteps echoed embarrassingly loud on the marble, each click of my leather soles announcing my presence like a herald I didn't want. The sound seemed to bounce off the high ceiling and rain down on me like judgment. I reached the reception desk, a slab of black granite that looked like it had been carved from a mountain and polished by angels. The woman behind it was young, blonde, and wore a headset so sleek it looked like it had grown there. Her smile was bright and professional, but her eyes were already bored before I opened my mouth. "Can I help you?" Her voice had the practiced cheerfulness of someone who dealt with 100 strangers a day and had learned to care about none of them. "I'm here to attend a meeting," I said, my voice sounding rougher than I'd intended. "The reading of Victoria Montoya's will, Roger Martinez." Her eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition, but not the good kind. The name Montoya registered. That was old money, serious money, the kind of client that kept places like this in business. But the face standing in front of her didn't match what she'd been expecting. She was probably expecting someone who looked like Danny, polished, expensive, belonging in a place like this. Not a weathered carpenter in a suit that had been fashionable when she was in elementary school. A flicker of confusion passed over her features, followed quickly by poorly concealed disdain before the professional mask snapped back into place. "Of course, Mr. Martinez," she said, her smile never wavering but somehow becoming less warm. "Mr. Pierce is expecting you. Please take a seat in our waiting area. They'll be with you shortly." She gestured toward a collection of low-slung black leather sofas arranged around a massive glass table. The magazines spread across its surface were the kinds that rich people read: architectural digests, financial reviews, society papers. Things I'd once subscribed to, back when I lived in a world where such things mattered. I sat on the edge of one of the sofas, the leather cold and stiff under me. I clasped my hands together, my rough carpenter's hands looking foreign against the expensive fabric of my old suit. Around me, the lobby hummed with quiet activity. Well-dressed people moved with purpose, their voices low but confident. Everyone belonged here except me. I looked up at the abstract art hanging on the walls, splashes of color and geometry that probably cost more than most people made in a year, but meant nothing to me beyond the raw materials and labor that had gone into creating them. Everything here was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors of their place in the hierarchy. I was a ghost in this place, a relic from a past everyone had agreed to forget. I was here to be told, in the most official way possible, that I was worth nothing. That 20 years of exile had been justified, that my son's contempt was earned, that Victoria's rejection had been the right choice all along. But as I sat there, surrounded by all that marble and mahogany and money, I found myself thinking about my workshop, about the smell of sawdust and the feel of honest wood under my hands, about the rocking chair I'd left half-finished, waiting for me to return and complete it. That chair would outlast this building. It would outlast all the money and power that filled these halls, because it was built by hand with care, from materials that had grown slowly and would endure. It had something this place, for all its grandeur, would never have. It had truth. They didn't just walk into the waiting room, they made an entrance. It was Danny, and he wasn't alone. He moved with the swagger of a man who had never been told no in his life, never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. He wore a navy blue Tom Ford suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body by angels. His hair was slicked back with something expensive, and his watch caught the lobby's perfect lighting like a beacon announcing his net worth to anyone who cared to look. Trailing behind him were his accessories. The first was a young woman, impossibly thin in that way that only comes from personal trainers and carefully managed nutrition. She was squeezed into a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, and she clutched a handbag like it was a life preserver. Her name, I would learn, was Brittany. She was absorbed in her phone, her thumb flicking across the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone whose entire world existed in that small rectangle. The second was a man in his 40s with a tan that was too perfect for October, in New York, and teeth that were too white to be natural. He had the fixed, predatory smile of someone who made his living separating fools from their money. This had to be Carl, the financial advisor Danny had mentioned in conversations I'd overheard years ago when we still spoke. They weren't a family mourning a loss. They were a pack of vultures circling what they believed was their kill, barely able to contain their excitement about the feast they were about to enjoy. Danny strode to the reception desk, not even glancing in my direction. "Danny Morrison," he announced to the blonde receptionist, his voice carrying just the right amount of authority and entitlement. "Edward Pierce is expecting me." The receptionist, who had barely looked at me with anything resembling warmth, was suddenly all smiles and efficiency for Danny. Her entire posture changed, straightening like a flower turning toward the sun. "Yes, Mr. Morrison. Right away, Mr. Morrison. Please have a seat, Mr. Morrison." He turned then, intending to claim one of the leather sofas as his throne, and his eyes finally landed on me. For just a moment, surprise flickered across his features. Then it was replaced by something much worse, a slow, cruel smile that spread across his face like an oil spill. He walked over to where I sat, his expensive shoes making no sound at all on the marble floor. Money, it seemed, even bought you the privilege of moving silently through the world. His two companions followed, their curiosity piqued by whatever drama was about to unfold. "My God," he said, his voice pitched loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "You actually came." He looked me up and down with the thoroughness of a livestock appraiser, his gaze lingering on my old suit, the slightly frayed collar of my shirt, the shoes that had been resoled more than once. I could see him cataloging every sign of my diminished circumstances, every piece of evidence that supported his narrative of my failure. "I guess you really do need that $15, he said to his entourage as if I wasn't sitting right there. "Look at him. 20 years, and this is what he's become." Brittany looked up from her phone for the first time, letting out a high-pitched giggle that sounded like breaking glass. Carl's predatory smile widened as he looked me over, not as a person but as an object of mild curiosity, something to be examined and then forgotten. This, Danny said, gesturing vaguely in my direction like I was an exhibit in a museum, is my father. He spoke the word father like it was something distasteful he'd found stuck to his shoe. It wasn't just dismissive, it was an apology. He was apologizing to his companions for my existence, for my shabby appearance, for the unfortunate biological fact that connected us. I remembered him at 10 years old, Christmas morning in our house in Connecticut. I had spent weeks in my workshop handcrafting a detailed model of a battleship. Every tiny cannon was carved by hand. Every miniature rope was coiled with care. Every detail was perfect. I had been so proud of it, so certain he would love something made especially for him with such care. He'd opened the box, looked at it for maybe 3 seconds, and then tossed it aside like garbage. It's not a brand name. He'd whined to the room as if that explained everything. I want what my friends have. Victoria had swooped in immediately with a brightly wrapped box containing the latest, most expensive video game console. She hadn't corrected him, hadn't explained the value of a gift made with love and time and skill. She had just solved the problem the easy way with money. She had been building this monster one spoiled whim at a time, and I had been too blind to see it. Now that 10-year-old boy stood before me in a $10,000 suit, still demanding brand names, still unable to see value in anything that couldn't be bought. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, meeting his smug, arrogant gaze and holding it steady. I didn't flinch, didn't defend myself, didn't give him the reaction he was fishing for. I just sat there, a ghost in a gray suit, watching the performance he was so desperate to give. My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any angry response could have. He'd been expecting something: begging, pleading, anger, anything that would confirm his power over me and justify the show he was putting on. Instead, I gave him nothing, just steady, patient observation. His smile tightened around the edges. He turned back to his disciples, needing to regain control of the narrative. "So the first thing we do," he said to Carl, his voice deliberately loud, "is liquidate the real estate portfolio and move everything into more aggressive growth investments. Then we'll look at expanding the business, maybe acquire some smaller firms." He was already spending money he hadn't inherited yet, already making plans for an empire he considered his by right. Carl nodded along like a bobblehead, making appropriate sounds of agreement and admiration. "The penthouse alone should net us at least $3 million, Danny continued. "And that's before we factor in the art collection and the jewelry. Mom always had excellent taste in investments." He was talking about Victoria like she was a stock portfolio that had finally matured, ready to be cashed in. There was no grief in his voice, no sense of loss. Just cold calculation and barely contained greed. Then the sound cut through the lobby like a knife through silk. The heavy oak door to the inner offices had opened, and a man stood in the doorway. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted, the temperature seeming to drop 10 degrees. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, wearing an impeccable gray suit that spoke of quiet authority rather than flashy wealth. His hair was silver, perfectly styled but not fussy. His face was the kind that belonged on old coins, distinguished, impassive, impossible to read. This was Edward Pierce, senior partner of Caldwell and Finch, and his presence commanded the kind of respect that money alone could never buy. It was the respect earned through decades of handling the most sensitive, most complex, most consequential legal matters for people whose names appeared in history books. His gaze swept across the lobby, taking in the scene before him with the cool assessment of a judge. He looked at Danny and his entourage, noting but not acknowledging their expensive clothes and presumptuous attitudes. Then his eyes found me sitting quietly on the edge of the leather sofa in my old suit. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something flicker in his expression. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't contempt. It was something much more dangerous than either of those things. It was understanding. Pierce walked toward me with measured steps. "Mr. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. "Thank you for coming." It wasn't just politeness. There was something in his tone that acknowledged my right to be there, my dignity as a human being. It was a simple courtesy that I hadn't received from anyone in this building except him. Only then did he turn to Danny, Mr. Morrison. The same name structure, but the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The subtle slight was so expertly delivered that only someone who lived in a world of status and hierarchy would catch it. But Danny caught it, and his jaw tightened. "Let's get this over with, Pierce." Danny snapped, his voice sharp with impatience and barely controlled entitlement. "I have reservations at Per Se to celebrate." Pierce's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once. "This way, gentlemen." The conference room was a monument to serious money. A massive mahogany table dominated the center, so perfectly polished it looked like a dark mirror. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one wall, but they offered no view of the sky, just the gray face of the skyscraper across the street. It was a room designed for making decisions that affected millions of dollars and thousands of lives. Danny naturally claimed the power position at the far end of the table, spreading his arms wide like he was already the king of this particular castle. Brittany and Carl flanked him like courtiers, ready to bask in whatever reflected glory came their way. I took a seat near the door, the afterthought, the legal requirement that had to be satisfied before the real business could begin. Pierce walked to the head of the table and placed a thick, leather-bound document on the surface with a soft but definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the hushed room like a gavel falling. He pulled out a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses with deliberate, methodical slowness. This is the last will and testament of Victoria Montoya, dated August 4th of this year. Even in death, she was making a statement. She'd taken my name in marriage, but she'd built her empire with her own. Montoya Designs had been her creation, her legacy, her identity. Pierce began reading in a neutral, professional monotone. Being of sound mind and body, I hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. Danny sighed theatrically and glanced at his expensive watch. He was already bored, already impatient to get to what he considered the main event. First, I give and bequeath $25,000 to my housekeeper, Rosa Valdez, for her 15 years of loyal service. Danny rolled his eyes and muttered something to Carl about peanuts, but I found myself smiling internally. Rosa. I remembered her. She'd always had a cup of hot coffee waiting for me in the kitchen after my arguments with Victoria. She deserved every penny. Second, I give and bequeath $50,000 to the Monarch Butterfly Preservation Fund. Brittany actually scoffed out loud. Butterflies? Seriously? My chest tightened. Before Danny was born, Victoria and I had driven an old Jeep down to Mexico to see the monarch sanctuaries. She'd stood in a clearing filled with millions of orange and black wings, tears streaming down her face. It's like all the souls in the world flying home, Roger, she'd whispered. Even after everything, she'd remembered that day. Pierce continued methodically through the smaller bequests, money for the driver, donations to various charities, personal items to longtime employees. Danny grew more agitated with each one, his fingers drumming impatiently on the mahogany surface. Finally, Pierce reached the main event. Article 7. To my son, Danny Morrison. Danny leaned forward, his breathing shallow, his entire body coiled like a spring. I give and bequeath the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue and my complete collection of jewelry and art. Danny's face lit up with triumph. Yes, now we're talking. Pierce held up a single finger. However, these items are secured in a safe within the penthouse. The key to that safe has been entrusted to Roger Martinez. The silence that followed was absolute. Danny's triumphant expression froze, then slowly cracked like ice under pressure. What? The word came out as a croak. What did you just say? The key was entrusted to your stepfather. Danny exploded upward, his chair crashing backward. This is insane. He hasn't seen her in 20 years. He's nobody. But Pierce was already reaching for a second document, a thin manila folder bound with red wax seal. That concludes the original will. This is a codicil legally binding, signed 3 weeks before your mother's stroke. He broke the seal and began reading what was clearly Victoria's own words, not legal language. To Danny, I'm writing this because I'm finally done being a coward. For 20 years, I've let you believe a lie about your stepfather that destroyed a good man. No, Danny whispered. Pierce's voice continued, relentless. The story you know, minus about Roger embezzling from my company, is completely false. 20 years ago, Montoya Designs was facing bankruptcy. We were offered a deal with criminals to launder money through our construction projects. If I refused, I'd go to prison for fraud. If I accepted, I'd eventually go to prison for money laundering. Danny was shaking his head frantically, but Pierce didn't stop. Roger stepped in. He put his name on everything, created shell companies, took all the legal risk to protect me and you. When the FBI came, they came for him exactly as we'd planned. He lost his architecture license, his reputation, his career. He did it to save us. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally consumed everything. And I repaid him by listening to your poison, by divorcing him, by letting you treat him like garbage. The $12 million you're expecting to inherit exists because Roger Martinez saved it. Pierce turned the final page. Therefore, I give my entire estate, the company, the properties, all assets, totaling $12 million to Roger Martinez. To Danny, I leave exactly what he so generously offered his stepfather. $15. Pierce produced a single check and slid it across the table. $15 for bus fare. Danny stared at it, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally complete breakdown. Carl and Brittany were already backing toward the door, abandoning their sinking ship. "This is fraud," Danny screamed. "I'll contest it." Pierce pressed an intercom button. 2 security guards entered and efficiently removed the screaming Danny from the room. When silence returned, Pierce looked at me. "She kept everything, Mr. Martinez, all the evidence of what really happened. It's in a safe behind a painting in the penthouse." He handed me a small brass key. "She wanted you to decide whether to make it public." I closed my fingers around the key. The money was nice, but this was my name back, my honor restored, the truth finally told. 20 years of lies had ended with one document. Victoria's final gift wasn't the money. It was the chance to be seen once again as the man I'd always been. The truth, like good craftsmanship, takes time, but when it's finally revealed, it lasts forever. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting back, but from standing quietly while the truth does the fighting for you, because lies may travel fast, but they can never outrun the patience of a man who knows his worth. In the end, real wealth isn't measured in millions of dollars, but in the moment when the people who wronged you finally see you for who you really are and realize they threw away something precious that no amount of money could ever replace.